Well, that didn't really work, did it? I guess I need to practice my Pikmin throwing skills, and the only way to do that is by playing through all of the games. Hello and welcome to the start of my Pikmin review marathon, where we're going to be tackling all 4 games released in the series, all the way from Pikmin 1 to Hey Pikmin for the 3DS. The reason that I want to do a marathon of all of these games is because I only very recently played the first one, and not to ruin the review or anything, I absolutely loved it. So after that, I figured I might as well do what I do best and go down a rabbit hole to experience all of the games the series has to offer. And while I have played Pikmin 1 before, Pikmin 2, 3 and Hey Pikmin are brand new to me, so I'm very interested to see what those are like. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves with all of that, because first we need to kick this marathon off properly by taking a look at Pikmin for the GameCube. Let's see what it's all about. Before we take a look at the actual game, I do want to acknowledge that there's a Wii version of it that's considered by most people to be the definitive version. It has widescreen support, it uses the Wiimote as a motion pointer so that you can move and throw Pikmin at the same time, as well as giving you more control over your Pikmin throwing. Pikmin behaviour is modified so that they don't break away from the group and get distracted. They don't die as fast when on fire or drowning, and perhaps one of the most important changes is that you can cycle through the different types of Pikmin in your party, something which would be incredibly helpful during combat. So with all of these changes, why would I opt to play the original GameCube version which doesn't do any of this stuff? Well, to be honest, it's simply because I want to build up my GameCube collection, because I think it's become potentially one of my favourite consoles recently. Beyond that, I kind of also want to go through the game in its original form, because that way I'll be experiencing the jump to Pikmin 2 in the same way people would have if they were buying these games on release. Does that make any sense at all? In my mind it does, but you might just be wondering what the hell I'm doing playing an inferior version of the game for basically no reason. But it's my video, damn it, and I want to play it on the GameCube. So the game opens up with a cutscene showing a spaceship getting hit by an asteroid and crash landing on a nearby unnamed planet. The lone pilot of this ship, called Olimar, wakes up after being knocked unconscious, and we take control of him as he briefly gets his bearings. I really like how for this very short section of the game, we have no control of the camera, and it's also really zoomed in. I think the idea with this is to cause a loss of sense of direction, and to replicate the wooziness that Olimar must be feeling after just being knocked out. After a little while of walking around though, we come across Olimar's ship, named the Dolphin, and he finds that it's been broken and lost 30 of its pieces across the surface of the planet. Adding to the panic of this situation, Olimar runs an analysis of the atmosphere on the planet and discovers it contains oxygen, which is poisonous to him, and his life support system in his suit will fail in 30 days. This is actually a really dramatic situation for a Nintendo game. Like, the stakes aren't just about rescuing a princess from a big turtle. No. If Olimar fails this mission to escape, he'll straight up die from breathing in the poisonous air. It's not really presented in a menacing way, of course, but I think this is actually a pretty brave move, and it adds this constant lingering pressure to every single decision you make. Not long after this, we pull up a sprout in the ground, only to discover our first member of the Pikmin species. This is where the game properly begins, and we get to grips with the focus of the gameplay. So, Pikmin is a bit of a strange game to describe in a way that makes it sound engaging and fun, and I imagine that this is the reason the series has never really become a smash hit in the same way a lot of other Nintendo properties have. When you're just watching a video of the gameplay like this, it could potentially look quite boring, but when you're actually playing it for yourself, it's really engaging. Basically, Pikmin is a real-time strategy game, but normally when you think of that, you think of stuff like Age of Empires or Command & Conquer, right? Stuff that for me can be a little bit uninteresting. There's many reasons that I don't normally like this sort of game, like the complexity of them making it difficult to actually get started, the lack of a focus on story, and the fact that you don't directly control a character. So it's almost like you, as the player, are removed from the action taking place, and you're just watching everything as this godlike entity. Pikmin turns all of this on its head though, because it's easy to get to grips with, and the basics are extremely easy to understand. There's also a story that slowly gets developed over the course of the game, even if this is somewhat minimal. And most importantly, you do control an actual character in the form of Olimar, whose name by the way is an anagram of Mario, which is a cute detail. The name of Olimar's ship, the Dolphin, is also a reference to the codename used for the GameCube before its official title was decided. So there's a lot of these little references to the history of Nintendo hidden in this game, which is cool to read into. Getting back to the game though, the basic gist of the gameplay here, at least at the start, is to get your single red Pikmin to bring pellets back to its little ship, called an onion, because Olimar is reminded of an onion when looking at it. And upon doing this, another red Pikmin will sprout from the ground, and you can then make the 2 red Pikmin bring back 2 more pellets, and they slowly multiply to the point where you have a small army. Now, the reason you want a small army is because not only can they now carry heavier pellets which result in even more Pikmin sprouting, but when you've got a certain number of them, they can also now interact with the environment to open up new areas. So for example, here in the first level, you need 10 Pikmin to push this box, which allows you to move forward and find the first missing part of your ship. And then you need the Pikmin to help you bring this ship piece back, to repair the dolphin and allow you to take off into space and rest, before exploring more of the planet the next day. Of course, while the beginning of the game is very simple, it does become a lot more interesting later on. When reaching the second level, called the Forest of Hope, you'll not only be a little bit intimidated by the size of it, but you'll also be coming across things that you straight up can't interact with that block your path. Things like rock walls and pools of water, which the red Pikmin can't do anything with. This is where the different Pikmin types come into play. When exploring the Forest of Hope, it won't be long until you come across the yellow Pikmin, and when exploring the third level, the Forest Navel, you'll discover the blue Pikmin. Each of these Pikmin have different strengths and weaknesses which make them suited to different tasks. So for example, the red Pikmin are probably the most versatile type, and will make up the bulk of your Pikmin army. These are stronger than the others, and cause more damage to enemies, and are also resistant to fire. The yellow Pikmin can be thrown a lot higher and further than the other types, and also have the ability to pick up bomb rocks, which can be used as weapons to deal damage to enemies, or can be used to blow up rock walls, unlocking shortcuts and unlocking new areas to explore. The blue Pikmin, meanwhile, are impervious to water, which allows you to get across lakes and avoid drowning in puddles. Actually, that's something I haven't mentioned yet. Olimar and the Pikmin are really small. In the game's manual, it says that they're around the size of a 50p coin, which by the way is some awesome localization for people living in the UK. But, that aside, that means that Olimar is around 4 centimeters tall, and the Pikmin are even smaller than him. What I like about this is that despite the world around you looking absolutely huge, with things like blades of grass sometimes towering over you, there's always this interesting perspective shift going on when you stop playing the game and think about it afterwards, and realise how small and insignificant Olimar and the Pikmin would be in reality. I feel like if you were a kid playing this game, you might even believe that this could actually happen, and your imagination could run wild thinking that the Pikmin and Olimar could be out there on this adventure right in your back garden. Pikmin being this childlike, imaginative adventure brings me back to being younger and believing that anything is possible, and I feel oddly nostalgic about Pikmin, despite the fact I never actually played it until recently, and I think that's really the sign of something special. But anyway, enough about that. The thing that I love most about Pikmin is the element of exploration and puzzle solving it has. The puzzles are all based around the environment, and have you think about how to use your Pikmin in different ways to accomplish certain tasks. Sometimes this is simple, like having to use the blue Pikmin to go across a lake and throw them up onto a platform to build a bridge to allow you to travel over there and bring a ship piece back. But there's a few occasions where the game requires you to use all 3 types of Pikmin in really interesting ways. By far the best example of this is in the 3rd level, which is set in this dark cave which is partially flooded and has these fire jets blasting out of the ground in certain areas. So firstly you need to bring a group of all 3 types of Pikmin to this area with fire jets, remembering that the yellow and blue Pikmin will die if they touch the fire. So you need to time your movement and bring them in smaller groups to avoid killing them all. After doing that, you reach this section where you build a bridge to a rock tower with a ship piece on the top. In order to get up there, you need the blue Pikmin to enter a small bit of water and activate a jet which boosts Olimar up to a higher ledge. But in order to actually get the ship piece, which is higher up than that, you need to throw the yellow Pikmin up there, because as I previously mentioned, they can be thrown much more effectively than the other types. When the ship piece has been brought down though, the yellow and blue Pikmin can't carry it back to the ship because of all of the fire that we previously went through. So you then need to use the red Pikmin to actually bring the piece home, safe and sound. It's just an absolutely brilliant section of the game, and while there are more bits like this, I feel like this is probably the best singular example of this situation. You really need to think about each step carefully and make the right decisions to not harm the Pikmin and retrieve the ship piece within a lingering constant time limit. Speaking of the time limit, let's talk a little bit about how that works. Pikmin is structured in a way where you have a set amount of time to explore a level before the day ends and you need to leave in your ship due to the creatures that lurk around at night time. Each day in the game is just over 15 minutes long, so the game becomes this constant battle of maximising efficiency in order to get as many ship parts as you can in a single day. While you could be put off of this idea because you just want to relax and enjoy the experience, I seriously doubt that you would ever run out of time, even if you completely wasted several of the days. You can still very much take your time with the game, but what this time limit does is almost forces you to multitask, sending one group of Pikmin to destroy a wall while you go off with another group to explore a new area and scout for another ship piece or something. Playing the game in this way makes it much more interesting because you constantly have 2 or 3 different projects on the go, and it has this effect of just making you want to play the game for one more day just to quickly finish a certain thing on your to-do list. But then after that, you'll always have another thing left on your to-do list, and it ends up making the gameplay experience super addictive and satisfying. But what happens if the time limit for the day expires and you still have Pikmin left out in the field? Well, then you're shown a cutscene where your ship blasts off and leaves them behind, where they're then alone and eaten by monsters that come out at night time. It's horrible to watch, and I always try my hardest not to leave any Pikmin behind because I hate helplessly watching as they're left stranded to die. This game really is quite dark if you peel back its layers. Adding to the sense of satisfaction you get from slowly piecing back together your ship is that every single ship piece you discover not only gets a response from Olimar, who writes about it in his ship log, but some of the ship pieces actually grant you some new abilities. The most important ship piece outside of the main engine, which allows you to actually take off at the start of the game, is the whimsical radar, which gives you a map of each level and displays all of the missing ship pieces on there. This is potentially an area of the game that could have been expanded a bit, with more pieces giving you access to more abilities. But I suppose the different types of Pikmin already do this, so it was probably deemed unnecessary to add in way more abilities on top of everything else. The logs that Olimar writes about the ship pieces, and upon finishing each day of the game, are really great too and give us loads of interesting tidbits of information about who Olimar is and more about the world he's stranded on. This is important because we need to know who the character we're playing as is in order to want to actually rescue him, and I think the game does this perfectly. For example, by collecting certain pieces of the ship, he'll mention that he has a wife and 2 children who he's constantly thinking about, which presents him as this family man who has a lot to lose if something goes wrong. And upon collecting the ship's Geiger counter used to measure radiation levels in the atmosphere, he'll mention that it's ticking a lot and finds it annoying, but quickly dismisses it. But what this does is brings to attention the possibility that this planet we're on is a post-apocalyptic Earth. The Pikmin and the other strange creatures we've been encountering have probably been created due to the massive amounts of radiation, and there's no signs of humans, which could indicate that they're all dead and gone. The planet definitely looks like Earth, and remnants of human activity can be found, like the cardboard boxes that the Pikmin can push, so I definitely think that this is true, which again is pretty dark for a Nintendo game. All this time Pikmin has secretly been a post-apocalyptic survival game, and it's been right under our noses the entire time. The last gameplay element that I'm yet to talk about is the combat, and there's a reason that I've not brought this up until now. This is the single area of the game that I think isn't quite as good as it could have been. Don't get me wrong though, it's not awful, and I actually think there's some really awesome ideas here. Most enemies have a certain weak spot which you need to discover in order to efficiently defeat them. So the Bulborb enemies are best defeated by throwing Pikmin onto their backs when they're defenseless, and there's several boss enemies throughout the game which are all really great too. For example, there's these weird underground bird things called burrowing snagrets, and the best way I've found to beat these is to throw Pikmin onto their heads as they come out from underground, and then use yourself as bait to keep it trying to peck at you before it goes back underground. There's also the armoured cannon beetle, which has the ability to suck in air and then spit out a rock, which will instantly kill any Pikmin it touches. This is extremely dangerous, but if you throw a Pikmin into its spout as it sucks in air, it will become clogged up and open up its back in order to release all the pressure, and then you can just throw all of your Pikmin onto its exposed skin and they'll rip into it. Which, when you think about it, is actually pretty violent for a cartoony game like this, but there we go, that's what happens. There's way more enemy types on top of this, but I won't ruin them because a part of the fun is figuring out all of these cool strategies for yourself. But yeah, on paper, this is all fantastic, and despite your only combat move being throwing the Pikmin, it's really surprising how many different ideas they had for the combat encounters, considering its simplicity. The issue with this is with certain more complicated enemies, it can be a bit difficult to engage them in the way that the game intends. This is because choosing what type of Pikmin you actually want to throw is a bit clunky. By far the best example of this is with the final boss of the game, so skip to here if you want to avoid seeing the final boss and seeing some of the strategies used to defeat it. We all good? Then let's go. So the final boss is supposed to be defeated by having you use a yellow Pikmin with a bomb to briefly knock it out and then use the red Pikmin to pummel its face to cause damage. The issue with this is that when you've got a ton of red and yellow Pikmin following you, you can't easily grab the single bomb-wielding yellow Pikmin that you need to damage the boss. Normally, arranging the Pikmin how you want isn't a big issue because you can just press a button and dismiss the group and they all gang together with their own colours, allowing you to select which ones you want. But when you're in a hectic combat situation with a boss, you can't stand there and dismiss all of your Pikmin, select the one you want, and then quickly get all of the others to follow you afterwards, because by the time you've done all of that, they'll all be dead. All the game needed was a button to select a specific colour of Pikmin, and this issue would have been completely eradicated. But because the game doesn't have this, there are several combat encounters that are way more difficult than they should be. However, what I will say is that I really don't feel like this detracts too much from the overall experience. Most of the time you can take things slowly and methodically select which Pikmin you want, and I found that even when things do get hectic, most of the time there's a workaround you can use so that the Pikmin selecting isn't too annoying. So for example, with the final fight, I got into a good rhythm by getting a group of yellow Pikmin to pick up bomb rocks and then dismissing them all. I then got a group of red Pikmin to follow me and ran ahead of them, quickly picked up a single bomb-wielding yellow Pikmin, and then ran to the arena with the yellow Pikmin in hand and the red group still trailing behind me. Then, after throwing the bomb at the boss and pummeling it with the red Pikmin, I ran away back to the group of bomb Pikmin and repeated the whole sequence again. It's clearly not as fast-paced as I think the boss was intended to be, but it does work doing it like this. Also, as I pointed out at the start of the video, this actually isn't an issue at all in the Wii version of the game because they implemented the ability to switch which colour of Pikmin you had in your hand. So to be honest, if you wanted to play this game for yourself, the Wii version is probably the way to go. Unless you're a weirdo like me who just wants to play the GameCube version for the sake of it. So while this one element of the game is a little bit clunky, everything else is pretty darn great, and I'm left with not a lot else to complain about, really. Graphically, I actually think the game looks really good, the water effects in particular look amazing, and the movement with all of the background details makes the worlds feel alive. And also, the way that the lighting dynamically changes as the day progresses feels way ahead of its time. Maybe it could have done with a few more distinct level themes, because really as it stands, there's 4 levels that are grassy themed and 1 that's a cave theme, and that's kind of it. But because the actual layouts are all very different, this actually didn't bother me too much. The music is really good too, being mostly laid back and ambient, but with enough of a melody to still have a decent presence and be memorable, and I feel like this does a good job of keeping the game relaxing, despite the time pressure looming over you. In fact, in general, I would actually say that this is a very relaxing game. It's not too difficult, but it's not too mindless either. It strikes this really great balance, and it's a game I feel like I'm gonna revisit a lot when I feel like just winding down. There's so much to love here that it's ridiculous. Like how each ship piece you get actually changes the look of the dolphin, which is another way the game gives you a constant sense of progression. And I even love the strangely arcade-like way that the game registers your Pikmin count, Pikmin lost, Pikmin left behind, and how quickly you completed the game once you've actually finished it. This makes it so that it's actually really replayable, because you're always left thinking that there's something you could have done slightly better, so when you play it again, you'll improve and you'll want to beat all of your high scores in all of these different areas. The ending of the game is determined by how many ship pieces you've collected either before the time runs out or as the time runs out. So you either get the best ending, which is of course the one I got because I always go for all 30 ship pieces, or you get the average ending for collecting the 25 essential ship pieces when time runs out, or you get the bad ending where you fail to get the 25 essential parts. Again, if you want to avoid spoilers for all of the different endings in the game, then skip to the time displayed on the screen now. The story in this game is kept very minimal though, so I don't really think I'm ruining too much by talking about this here. So, let's get into it. The good ending is obviously the canon one. This is where Olimar goes to blast off in his ship and return home, but the Pikmin greet him there and say goodbye, and they watch him as he blasts off into space. Because the Pikmin have now been trained in combat by Olimar, they then go to attack a nearby Bulborb enemy on their own, and are no longer at the bottom of the food chain. While Olimar is flying home, we see a load of onions slowly drifting after him, but the thing is, these onions are coloured differently to the red, blue and yellow ones we've seen in the game, meaning that there's more types of Pikmin that we didn't actually see, thus implying that there's going to be a sequel. The average ending is mostly the same, apart from the Pikmin don't give Olimar as big of a send-off, and the other coloured onions don't follow him into space. But the bad ending is actually quite dramatically different, and is probably the most interesting. In this ending, Olimar attempts to blast off into space with his incomplete ship, but it crashes again. And with Olimar's life support slowly failing, the Pikmin grab him and take him to an onion, where he's lifted into it, and he gets planted into the ground with a Pikmin sprout on his head. This implies that he's somehow been turned into a new type of Pikmin species, which is really weird, and obviously isn't canon. But it's nice that we don't just see Olimar slowly die as poison fills his lungs, I suppose. After you've finished the game, there's one extra mode that we've got left to talk about, which is accessible on the main menu. And this is the challenge mode.
The challenge mode is a simple side mode of the game where you compete on a scoreboard to see who can create the most Pikmin in a certain stage within a single day. The layouts and enemy placements in the levels has been slightly changed with this goal in mind, and obviously with the number of Pikmin being the overall goal here, there's much more of an emphasis on combat than in the main game. Where you might want to avoid confrontations in the main game, here you're always going to want to kill as much as possible so that you can bring the creatures' dead bodies back to the onions to spawn in more Pikmin. It's a nice little distraction and could be competitive if you have a friend who's a fan of Pikmin as well, but it's a bit of a shame that this mode wasn't playable with 2 or more players. I think that would have made for a far more interesting experience. It could have even been separated into competitive and cooperative modes, where one is about getting an individual score greater than your opponent's, and the other is about getting the highest combined score. As it stands, the challenge mode isn't much to write home about, and I personally would always stick to the main game. As a nice extra, it's fine though. If I was being extra picky, I would say that it's also a little bit of a shame that there's no other unlockables outside of this extra mode. Maybe some cosmetic unlockables for the Pikmin, Olimar and the Dolphin would have been cool, and the criteria for unlocking these could have been for doing the game in a certain number of days, or losing less than a certain amount of Pikmin. I think that would have incentivized replayability even more, but like I say, that's being very picky, because I feel like there's already a lot of replay value without that.
So what's my opinion on Pikmin 1? It's awesome. While it is maybe a little bit simple and there's tons of room for improving the formula and making something more mechanically complex, what we do have is filled with personality, and I just absolutely love the basic concept of being stranded on this mysterious planet fighting to survive. This is a genre of game that I'm normally not interested in at all, but because of that Nintendo magic, we have something here that's not only incredible, but is also severely underrated in my opinion.
Of course, with this being the first game I've covered in the series, Pikmin is going in first place in my series ranking because there's literally nowhere else for it to go. The character designs are so adorable, the development of Olimar through the ship logs is superbly done and he quickly becomes a very lovable character. The gameplay is really original, perhaps so much so that the game becomes slightly difficult to market to a mass audience. The graphics are great and there's some technical elements which are very impressive, like the dynamic lighting and the sheer amount of Pikmin which can be displayed on screen at the same time without it ever dropping any frames. The music gives the game a lot of its identity, with it being quite natural sounding and relaxing. And the controls are also really good, even when you're playing the GameCube version. There's so little to complain about with this that I'm actually a little bit concerned that I'm not going to like Pikmin 2 as much as the first one. But I'm also really excited to dive into it because I want to see if it expands on the basic concepts presented in the first game while offering more level theme variety, potentially a bit more story development, and fixing the Pikmin selection problem I had. If it does all of that, then we've struck gold.
But with that, we've wrapped up the review of Pikmin 1 for the GameCube. Next time in the Pikmin Marathon, we're going to be taking a look at the second game released in the series, with Pikmin 2. As always, give the video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe to see more stuff like this coming soon, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!